Thank you for coming to this lecture. Welcome at Studium Generale. My name is Jaap Jansen and I'm program maker at Studium Generale. And well, every day we are being bombarded by all kinds of visual information, visual stimuli. And our brain has the incredible capacity of processing this visual information and filtering out the relevant details for us. How does our brain do that? And what does our brain make of the world around us, of the outside world? That's the question that we are going to try to answer tonight. And our guest tonight is Surya Gayet, and I thank you for coming to Maastricht. It's a pleasure to have you here. He has to sit behind the desk because he has injured his leg, so it looks a little bit... we can't help it, but he will do his best, I'm sure. And he will explain how our brain creates a conscious experience of the world around us. And Surya Gayet is assistant professor in experimental psychology at Utrecht University. He is head of the CAP Lab group. And this is a group, it's also an abbreviation, but maybe you will explain it. The CAP Lab group, that's a group of researchers studying the science of consciousness, attention, perception, and memory. And he works with the Visual Cognitive Neuroscience Lab at the Donders Institute in Nijmegen and at the Attention Lab also in Utrecht. The lecture will take around an hour, and after the lecture we have half an hour for Q&A. So please, may I have your applause for Surya. The floor is yours.
Thanks for the kind introduction. Can everyone hear me in the back as well? Yes? Okay, that's good. Perfect. If not, then I'm going to lean awkward towards the front. So I'm the type of lecturer that would typically walk around, but unfortunately I'm not going to do that because limping looks really awkward, so I'm not going to do that today. Just imagine me limping around, and that's better, I guess, for everyone. So today I'm here to tell you something about how you experience the world, and I want to convey that your conscious experience of the world around you, everything that you feel, that you see, that you hear, that is not a replica of what is out there. It's not a replica of the physical reality, but it's more of a mental construct or a simulation that your brain has created for you in order to optimally thrive in your environment. It's an advanced piece of software that helps you survive. And most of your experiences, that's what I'm going to explain to you, most of what you experience, what you consciously perceive, is based on your prior knowledge and on your expectations, and not so much on your sensory input. So not so much on what your eyes and ears receive. Now, I'm not the first one to say something like that. So if you go back a couple of thousand years to Plato, the Greek philosopher, he had a very nice allegory of the cave. And in this allegory, the idea was that there were a couple of people that were born and chained in a cave. That's the people on the left, on the bottom left. They have never been outside of this cave because they are born and chained and they stay there their entire life. The only thing they can see from the outside world are these shadows. For instance, the shadow of the horse and the shadow of the wolf. Now, to them, these shadows are the horse, and these shadows are the wolf. There is nothing more real than these shadows. Now, the story that Plato was trying to tell with this is that you had basically, well, the normal people, the normies, as he probably called them in ancient Greek, who were trapped in the cave, like you and I, were all trapped in the cave. And then there were the philosophers. They were enlightened. And the philosophers were the only ones that could actually see the real world outside of the cave. Now, the point that I want to make is that for all of us, philosophers included, I'm sorry if there are philosophers in the room, but for all of us, philosophers included, we're all trapped in our brain in the same way that these people were trapped in the cave. And the only access we have to the outside world are these shadows. And in our case, these shadows are activity in our brain, neurons that are firing. What I experience is not you sitting out there. What I experience is neurons that are correlated to whenever you are out there. I have no direct access to the outside brain. So I am trapped in the cave. There is a physical world. I'm not going to deny the existence of a physical world. We just don't have any direct access to it. Whether I'm hallucinating you guys, or whether I'm perceiving you guys, or whether I'm dreaming all of you guys and girls, there is no difference from my perspective. It's the same neurons that are active, whether you're actually there or not. So I am trapped in the cave, and all I can see are the shadows. And because all that we have, all that we experience is just based on this brain activity is heavily dependent on our brains. And your brain is different from your brain is different from your brain, which is different from your brain, which means that all of your conscious experiences are inherently different. You're all trapped in your own cave. You're all looking at me, at the same person, the same situation, the same physical world, but you're all trapped in your own cave, and therefore you all have your own experiences. Now, in daily life, you may actually come across these types of situations where you're looking at the same thing as someone else, but you don't seem to experience the same thing. So maybe you have this very simple idea that you think is very compelling, or maybe you have an idea, you created a song that you like a lot, or you made a drawing that you liked a lot, or you have a graph that you think is really cool, and you show it to someone else, and they just don't seem to get it. They are looking at the same thing, but they experience something radically different, because their brain is different from your brain, and what seems very simple to you might be very complex to them without the same background as you have. So, although we look at the same thing, we might see something very different. And this realization is key not only for collaborating with people, but also for empathizing with others and for communicating during your work and during your private life. Now, these types of problems lie at the core of what I study, as has been introduced by Jaap. I study perception, and perception is mostly studied in vision and audition, although Garmt Dijksterhuis there will say that there are other senses as well. I'm sure he can tell you a lot about those some other time. Inherently, then you also have to study attention. Attention is basically your filtering mechanisms. I focus on this and not on that. I focus on that, but not on these. And then eventually, sort of what we all experience is what is referred to as consciousness or awareness. These words are often used relatively interchangeably. And I have to study short-term memory because that's what ties it all together. So I do this at Utrecht University, and it has been told already, I do this with the CAP Lab, and the CAP Lab are a wonderful group of people that do studies, and they do actually the actual hard work while I'm trying to sort of get money and funding. They do the actual work in the lab. So together with this team, I try to understand how we perceive the world, and how we get from this information, these photons, if you will, entering our eyes, into a sort of a conscious experience of the world that we understand. And I use a variety of tools. So for instance, I use eye tracking, which is a way to track where your pupil is moving, to see where people are looking on a screen. So you can learn all types of things about people's internal world just by looking at how the eye moves and how the pupil changes size. For instance, you can look at how they look at your web page. And you can generate heat maps of, oh, they're looking a bit more there, probably I should put my picture there. It's basically sort of a gateway into the mind, a very cheap gateway into the mind. More expensive gateways into the mind that I use a lot as well are EEG and fMRI. Those are two neuroimaging techniques that we use to measure brain activity. And one of my former students, Dasha, is here, who actually worked on fMRI stuff with me. And some of you might know fMRI, this big-ass magnet, which is a tad larger than your average fridge magnet, which has a magnetic field that is a lot stronger than the Earth's magnetic field. And what happens if you put someone in the MRI scanner is that you can get very nice 3D images of, for instance, someone's brain. but you can also tune it such that you get images of brain activity. And what we can do with that is that based on patterns of brain activity using machine learning techniques, we can reconstruct people's experiences in part. So for instance, whether they're looking at one color or the other, or whether they're thinking of a house or thinking of a face. And that sort of things we can actually reconstruct from brain activity. And all of these methods we employ to understand how you experience the world. And you may wonder, like, why am I focused at all on perception? And well, that is because our perception of the world, our conscious perception, is the only thing we have. If we have no conscious perception, everything is dark and everything is silent, and there is nothing to talk about. Right? It would be like robots. There's no point to it all. So perception is all that we have, and visual perception in particular, especially for those with let's call it normal vision, or corrected to normal vision, it's the most important gateway that we have to the outside world. We rely on vision a lot, even to the extent of saying that if I don't see it, I don't believe it. You have to see it to believe it. And in different languages, there are different variants of that same expression that really show that we want to see something before we believe it. Now, today I want to say that there's actually another side to this. Seeing is believing is maybe something that we feel is right, but what is actually mostly happening is that believing is seeing. What we perceive is by and large determined by what we predict, what we expect, by our knowledge. And this is fundamentally different from how a camera looks at the world. A camera would assign equal importance to each specific pixel in the visual field. And we don't, luckily, otherwise we would probably not survive. Now let me give you an example. So when you're awake, when you're looking around, like now, I hope you're still awake. I just started, so it would be good. We experience a very rich visual world, right? It has colors, it has movement, it is basically full HD, widescreen, high res, right? That's how you experience the world. But then if we look at the actual light that enters our eyes, that enters our retina, that is actually quite small. This little thing that is moving there, that is about your thumb's width at an arm's length. That is what you see sharply of the world around you. The rest is mostly a blur. You wouldn't be able to distinguish between your mother and a panda if it's outside of this fovea, for lack of a better example. And basically what you're seeing is illustrated in this top right corner, right? So not only is it very small, but it's also moving about 3 times a second. 3 times a second we make a very jerky eye movement to the next location, and then to the next location, and to the next location. And that not only is it small and jerky, but when it enters our brain, the image is also upside down, because that's how the retina works, right? And this is what our brain has to work with. The experience that you have now is initially based on this sort of very bad initial image. And with this, we have to do tons of things, right? We have to somehow navigate in this world. We have to find our way. I had to find my way to Maastricht. We have to locate dangers and threats, preferably before they detect us. We have to interact with others. We have to sort of ensure our position and hierarchy in sort of a social situation, or maybe improve it even. And we want to recognize objects to be able to interact with those in the world, right? And that means that all of this we have to do with this sort of very bad information that we receive from our eyes. And you could also say that our conscious experience is sort of the model that our mind has created just for the purpose of doing all these tasks, just for the purpose of surviving, of navigating, of interacting and avoiding threats. The downside is that conscious experience is very expensive. Just like when you go to a store and you buy stuff that can be expensive, also cognitive processes, stuff that you do with your brain, has a metabolic cost. And in particular, consciousness turns out to be quite expensive. Now, there's this seminal study from the 90s, from De Haan. What they did is that they presented words very briefly. It was not actually the word Maastricht then, it was just a variety of different words. And they presented it so briefly, and then also sandwiched by strings of X's, that people would sometimes see the words and sometimes not. but they were always presented in the same manner. Just by chance, sometimes they would see them, sometimes not. And then if you look at the brain activity, when they did not see the words, there was only very local activity in what we call visual cortex. It's a little bit of cortex in the back here that is interested in visual information. Just a little bit of activity there. Now, if the exact same words had been perceived consciously, then you actually see widespread activity throughout the entire cortex. So this was sort of the first study indicating that given the same sensory input, given the exact same thing that you're looking at, having a conscious experience makes it very metabolically expensive, right? Now, if conscious experiences are so expensive, right, we probably don't want to consciously process everything that comes in, right? As I said, we're not receiving a lot of information through our eyes, but still, 3 times a second we have a new image, right? And all of these images has shape, has color, and so on. So that's still quite a lot. If you would want to consciously process all of that, that is quite some computational costs that you probably don't have if you don't want to be eating all day to compensate. So that means that all the sensory input that comes in through your eyes, through your ears, and so on, is involved in a continuous battle for conscious access. And here it would be beneficial if we would prioritize things that are relevant to us, relevant to our survival, over things that are not relevant to us. And this competition has been one of the focus areas of my lab in the past decade or so. Now, what is relevant to you might not be relevant to me. And what is relevant to you now might not be relevant to you a year from now, right? So maybe you have encountered a situation that you have bought a car, it was a red car, and all of a sudden you see red cars everywhere. You didn't see them beforehand. Red cars were not relevant to you, right? You bought a car that was red, now red cars are relevant, you see them everywhere. Or when I got a kid, we had a stroller, suddenly strollers everywhere. When I first got into a relationship with my girlfriend, suddenly there were caps everywhere, she told me. Everyone suddenly was walking around with a cap, right? What is relevant to you will be prioritized by your visual system. Now, another aspect that determines whether information will be maybe relevant and should be prioritized is whether it is likely to occur or not. Well, you may be familiar with this story, which I don't know if it's true or not, it doesn't really matter for now, but this story about the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas that supposedly did not see Columbus's ships arriving. Although they were very big, they were in plain sight, but because they didn't expect them, they didn't know what they could look like, and because of that, they didn't see it. Well, I don't know whether this story is true, but we did something very similar in the lab, which showed that it's at least possible. So what we did is there were a bunch of participants and they had to do something very similar. It was not with ships, but they just saw triangles very briefly. And so the only thing they had to do is tell me whether the triangle was on the right or on the left side of the screen. That's very trivial. You should be able to do that, right? But unless if it's presented very briefly, then it's very difficult. Now, the manipulation that we added was that the triangle was pointing upwards in most of the cases for this group of participants. And only in a minority of instances was the triangle pointing downwards. And what we found is that participants were way better in localizing the triangle that was more likely to occur. Just because I showed them an upward pointing triangle more often caused them to be able to better localize, to locate this triangle in the world. And they were not able to localize the one that was uncommon. Now, of course, maybe people are just generally good at upward pointing triangles. So in another group of participants, we basically did the same, but then we reversed it. And in this case, 80% of the cases were downward pointing triangles, and now people were a lot better at recognizing downward pointing triangles, right? So our brain gives priority to events that are likely to occur. And that makes sense because unlikely events are maybe more likely to be just caused by noise, right? There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of sensory uncertainty in what we register through our eyes. If in the side of my eyes, I suddenly sort of in my periphery, I see something that looks like an elephant, my brain is going to discard it because it's very unlikely that an elephant appeared here. However, if I see something that looks like a microphone, I'm likely to think, well, this is probably the case, right? Because this is a very normal thing to happen here, right? So we prioritize things that are likely. That works a lot. Also, we would want to prioritize information that's threatening, right? It's probably better to quickly detect a spider than to quickly detect a flower. If you miss the flower, well, maybe you wanted to get some flowers for your partner and then you missed it, too bad, but you're probably not going to die. And otherwise you'd probably get a divorce. But the spider, if you miss it once, then that might really be problematic, right? So we wondered first whether people actually see spiders more easily than flowers. So what you do then in the lab, you sort of hide it in a bunch of noise. Of course, this is a simplified version of the experiment. And then you measure how easily they can detect the spider or the flower. And what you see is that people are better at detecting spiders than flowers, which is fine and all. But the most important thing is that this was particularly the case for people that are afraid of spiders, and not so much for people that are not afraid of spiders. So it's really about what is relevant to you, based on your prior beliefs, your expectations, your views of the world, that is going to be prioritized by your visual system. Another elegant way to do this is to give people completely meaningless stimuli. So you give them images on the screen that are devoid of any meaning, like a blue circle and a green circle. I mean, there's no sort of emotional relation to any of those, I would hope. But what you can then do is that immediately after presenting a blue circle for one group of participants, you give them an electric shock. After you do this a couple of times, they learn that whenever a blue circle appears, this signals threat, like actual threat. They actually get pain. Now, this was a fun experiment to conduct. I called it a shocking experiment to recruit participants, and then it turned out that they regretted participating because it was not so fun. But what you see then is that these images that are initially completely devoid of any meaning, initially they don't signal threat at all, but once they start to signal threat because people learn that a shock will be associated with them, then suddenly they're actually faster and better at detecting those blue circles as compared to the green circles. And of course, if you pair the green circles with a shock, you find the inverse effect. So the visual system has really increased its readiness to perceived threat. Now, our conscious perception of the world is therefore not a copy of the outside world, but it is a model of the world, or you could call it a simulation, which is built from the bits of sensory input that you selected, or your brain. But what is always the case with a model is that it inherently omits a lot of information, right? The tiger was selected, you experienced it, but all the other stuff you didn't. Which is good, that's useful for your behavior, but it does entail that most of the things that are in front of you, you are not actually aware of. And this is what a model does, right? So for instance, if you have a model of the solar system, it's also omitting a lot of information. Actually, a model of the solar system would not be useful if it is actually exhaustive. If it contains all the information about the solar system, you would actually need to rebuild the solar system, in which case you haven't gained any knowledge. There's no point in that. And then the same holds true for your conscious experience, which is a model of the outside world, and therefore it omits a lot of information. So, okay, I'm telling you we failed to register some parts of the world that we're looking at, but how bad is it really? So let's do a little experiment. So I'm going to ask you now to look at the image that I'm going to flicker on the screen. And your job is to just raise your hand if you see what is changing in the image every time it flickers. So don't shout what it is, because then you spoil it for the rest. Just raise your hand if you see what is changing in the image. Here we go. I have about 1 hour, so that's fine. So there's one person now who sees it. The others are starting to get annoyed. Oh, still, is it flickering anymore? No, it's not. Oh, what's happening? Oh, this is a bummer. Okay, so unfortunately it stopped flickering. So now you might see it, since I spoiled it. It is the railing here in the back of the image. I think everyone can see it now since I'm pointing it out. So I'm not sure how long it was actually flickering, because I saw that it stopped at some point. but typically I can wait for about 2 minutes and then half of the room sees it. And what is interesting about it is that once you see it, it's very obvious, right? It's dead obvious. If you don't see it, what's happening there, right? Because there's this thing that is as wide as the entire image. It is just in between the two faces that you've been looking at a couple of times, maybe 5 times even. It's moving back and forth, and it's really in the center of your field of view. Why are you not seeing it? The interesting thing is that you did see an entire image, right? I think all of you saw a rectangle. So you're seeing an entire rectangular image, but you don't see something as big as that in the center of that image that is moving up and down. So this shows you, first of all, how little you actually register of the outside world, unless you just coincidentally happen to attend one of those locations where the rail was moving, you would not see it. But what it also illustrates is that your brain is filling in the rest for you, just for you to make a complete image of a rectangle. Now that's interesting. And if you consider what enters your eyes versus what you perceive, you can wonder, like, why is my perception of the world so rich when what enters my eyes is so impoverished? Well, it's because your conscious experience of the world is actually rich. You actually have a rich conscious experience of the world. It's just not a veridical representation of what is out there. It's false. It's rich, it's full HD, high res, but not accurate. And your brain fills it in for you so that you actually have a coherent image of the world in front of you. And it fills it in not randomly, of course, it fills it in based on your knowledge and your expectations. Now, this idea of filling in is nicely illustrated by a famous study, again from the 90s. And what they did here is that they had participants read stuff on a screen while their eyes were being monitored with an eye tracker so that the experimenters could see exactly where people were looking. Right? They could see exactly on which word people were foveating. And the little trick that they did here is they had this so-called gaze contingent display where they would, depending on where people look, they would change everything else into X's. All the words except for the single word that people were fixating on were changed into X's. And then you might wonder, what did the participants experience? Nothing. They just saw a page full of words, because they extrapolated. What you would normally see in your periphery when you're looking at a word is that the rest are also words. All the X's were not seen, they just saw words everywhere, no X's. So you might wonder, like, okay, who cares about some letters that you're not even looking at, right? So probably if something really matters, if something is really important to you, then you would see it. Maybe, but maybe no. So this is the A10 highway near the Koentunnel entrance in Amsterdam. And there they have, in the middle of the highway, they have this, this rail, how do you call it? This barrier. And it's high contrast, it's red and white striped. It's at eye height for a driver, right? There's also these flickering orange lights moving left to right. You could say there's nothing more conspicuous than this, you cannot miss it. However, and if you then see this news article from the AD, they say every week drivers smash into the barrier. We are waiting for the 20th accident. People would not see it simply because they don't expect a barrier in the middle of the highway. Right? And this actually had fatal consequences. This is not like words turning into X's. This is actually people not living anymore because of this. Now, they changed a few things there, and one of the noticeable changes is that now it's not orange flickering lights, but it's 2 red lights that are about this far apart, which is akin to a car driving in front of you, which is something which is way more typical in terms of what you would see on a highway. And there have been very few accidents, but it has not been related empirically whether this is actually solving the problem. So this can be problematic, right? You can miss very conspicuous things that are really right in front of you. And what about experts, right? Can we train our way out of this? Can we train our way out? Maybe. This is what this study tried to find out. It's a very fun study. What they did here, it was a bunch of naive participants and a bunch of expert radiologists that were looking at lung scans. And their goal was to find little nodules in the lungs. Now, luckily, the radiologists were better than the naive observers in finding the lobules. I would hope so. But what they manipulated is that they were actually hiding an image of a gorilla in one of the lung scans. And the gorilla image was 48 times larger on average than the little nodules that they had to detect. 48 times larger than the nodules. Now, none of the naive observers found the gorilla, but even 80% of the radiologists, right, that are trained for looking at lungs, looking for anomalies, missed the giant gorilla in the lungs. Now, maybe this is bad, maybe this is good, right? Because they did find all the lobules, right? So you can argue both ways. So you can wonder, why didn't our brains just evolve to be perfect, to register everything that's in our field of view? Well, let's evaluate. There's you, right? You are blind to most of this image that we just showed, but you're functioning fine. Well, I assume you managed to make it here. I think you're doing more or less fine, sort of on a global scale. And then there's someone like Kim Peek, who is basically the inspiration for the film Rain Man, who has photographic memory, meaning he's not filtering stuff out too much, he's basically registering everything. He can read 2 pages simultaneously. If you tell him like October 27, 1983, he can tell you that it's a Tuesday, and so on. However, to shave or to tie his laces, he needs his dad, right? Very good. He's not filtering, he's registering everything, but he's not able to function. So that's sort of the downside, I would say. So even though your brain is sort of making up most of the things in front of you, even though your brain is also not registering most of the things in front of you, most of the times your brain does a good job because you're doing good, you're here, you managed it. Now, I'm going to prove to you that your brain is doing a good job. I'm not only here to trick you, I also want to show you that sometimes your brain is actually doing a good job. So for instance, for this next example, imagine you just had breakfast, you want to go to work, so you enter the bathroom and you look for your toothbrush. Now, your job here is to look for the toothbrush in the next image, and I will show it only very briefly. Now, to prove to me that you found the toothbrush, you need to report to me what the color of this toothbrush is afterwards. Okay, are you all ready? Okay, so find the toothbrush. Okay, now, what color was the toothbrush? Who goes with yellow? Bunch of yellow. Who goes with green? More green. Who goes with blue? Couple more blue. And who goes with red? Okay, I have no explanation for red. What is interesting, you're actually pretty good, by the way. This is the best audience I've seen for this. Most people typically see indeed this green toothbrush here, but then fail to notice the giant blue toothbrush that is over there. Now, this is interesting for many reasons, right? So first of all, you were able to, or at least half of you were sort of able to find a toothbrush in half a second. But to do so, what you apparently did was sort of gauge how large the toothbrush would be based on the scene image, where it's likely to occur or not, sort of segregating like the scene semantics. And all of this for this very tiny thing, it's very difficult to see, right? And then somehow at the same time, you also filtered out this UJS toothbrush on the side. Which is, well, it makes sense, right? Because of course it's quite conspicuous. But then again, who puts their toothbrush on top of the toilet bowl? Also, who has such a big mouth, right? This doesn't work for most of you. So this is not a useful toothbrush to have. But what it shows that you really use your knowledge to perceive the world. You're good at it, and you're able to do so. And typically this works really well. But sometimes it doesn't, right? And so we went to the streets in The Hague, and we did a little experiment there to show how you actually filter out irrelevant information. And the experiment that we did there, some of you may know it, especially those that maybe followed some psychology classes at some point. What we did here is that one of us, an actor, asked the direction to passers-by, right? And then we'd ask them, how do I get to this or that church? That's her in this case. And then while she's asking for direction, we would swap her. So someone would pass by with a big panel, which was me in this case. Here it happens. And then underneath the panel, someone else emerges. and then suddenly they are faced with a new person, which they're talking to at 50 centimeter distance. And then the question is, do they just sort of continue their conversation and explain where to go next? Or do they notice that something is strange with the person that is 50 centimeters away from them that they were having a conversation with? And so we've done this a couple of times, and the thing is, I'm not the first one who did this, right? There are videos from the States from like 20 years ago or so where they also did this. And I always showed this in my lectures, but then I wondered, does it really work? So that's why we wanted to try it. 7 out of 7. No one ever notices that the person changes. And I was quite surprised. I thought maybe I need to change my lectures. No, it's perfect. There was actually one person in here who said to the person who re-emerged after the panel, he said, oh, once these sort of construction people pushed me aside, I thought I was in one of those psychology experiments where I'm suddenly talking to a new person. And he said that to the new person that he was talking to. And I couldn't believe myself. And afterwards, we had to run towards them to ask them whether they were okay with us using the footage and to also test whether they really had no idea. And they really had no idea. They just don't expect people to magically change, right? And also, it's not relevant to you. What you want to do is just sort of, I don't know, you want to go home, you want to go to your work or whatever. And so quickly you explain the directions, but you don't really care who you're explaining it to. So if it's not relevant to us, you just discard it. Okay, so what I hope to have conveyed until now is that your perception is shaped quite a lot by your predictions. And what does it actually mean? And one influential view on this predictive account of conscious perception is based on Bayes' theorem. So this is a statistician from the 18th century, and this is the rough idea. So if there are statisticians here, I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher the theory. If there are non-statisticians here, I'm sorry, I'm going to do some stats, but it's quite straightforward. So imagine you see me arriving here on these crutches. Now, your prior belief may be that because I am an academic, it is unlikely that this was caused by a shooting incident, right? That could be your prior belief, right? Then new evidence comes in. You read in a newspaper that an academic with a cap was shot. Could happen. And then your new belief has shifted from this prior belief, where you say can never happen, has shifted towards this new evidence, right? And this posterior belief, what it's called, that is basically sort of the shifted belief, which is a weighted sum of what you used to believe and the new evidence that is coming in, this posterior, that is your current belief, and that could be your conscious experience. Now I'm going to explain to you how this worked, but first I want to say that I was not shot. I just slipped while running for the tram, so it's not very much of a cool accident. So remember that believing is seeing, right? So what you consciously experience, according to Bayesian theories of consciousness, is this posterior distribution. Now, what does it look like? That means that first, you're creating an experience of the world just based on your prior knowledge. And then as new data, new evidence comes in from your eyes, from your ears, but also taste and all other senses, your posterior belief, which is thus your conscious experience, shifts a little bit, right? So with every bit of data coming in, you basically adjust your prior belief. You adjust your belief of the world. So what you experience is your posterior, and this is a very cheap way of having a very rich experience because your knowledge is already in place, right? So you have a very rich experience, you can sort of a priori construct it, but then adjust it based on what your senses register. And the smart thing you can do then is that if your senses register something that is in line with your predictions, you don't have to do anything. That's cheap. It's only in the cases where your senses register something that is not in line with your predictions that you have to make a small adjustment. And in this theory, this is called a prediction error. So you send back to the system something that says this is an error, and then you adjust your prior belief, you adjust your knowledge, and your experience changes along with it. That's the idea of Bayesian accounts of perception, of conscious experience. And the nice thing about this is that this prior knowledge is already there, so it's quite cheap to already have that in place, but processing all this sensory input, as we've already seen, is quite expensive. But then you wonder, what is this knowledge? Where do we get all this knowledge from? Well, the good news is that the world is not random. There's a lot of structure in the world, and we can capitalize on this structure to be able to predict things. Now, for instance, if you look at this checkerboard, you can see that there are dark tiles and lighter tiles. Now, some of you may already suspect that something is happening. Here, the dark tile and the white tile that I'm pointing at are identical. So if I remove the context, you can actually see that they are the same. Now, knowing that, if I could put back the context in, you still see a dark tile and a light tile. Why is that? It's because there is this blue cylinder that is casting a shadow over the tiles. And you have learned, or not you, but your brain has learned, that whenever a shadow is casted over something, that thing becomes darker. So your brain compensates for that. Why? Because you want to be able to recognize a light tile irrespective of whether there is a shadow casted over it or not. It would be very inconvenient if you would change the lighting conditions that we wouldn't recognize anything anymore. So we are compensating for the ambient lighting in this case. And even if you know it, even now I told you, you cannot unsee it. You still see the top part here as dark and the bottom part as light, even though they're actually completely the same. Now, as a wise man once said, you can say, well, it doesn't matter if it's black or white, right? Who cares? I will show you that you actually do care. So for instance, here there's this red flag, or there's this red can of Coke, or there are these red strawberries. And of course, I wouldn't be showing all of these to you if actually there isn't a single red pixel on this entire slide. This is all just gray. Now, is this an error of your brain? Is your brain just screwing up things for you? No, because if you're actually looking for a strawberry that is ripe to eat, then this is the color that it would have considering the ambient lighting. So again, you're taking into account the ambient lighting conditions, the environment, in order to have perception that is useful for your survival, for your interaction with the things that are out there. So our perception is not accurate. Red, the experience of red has nothing to do with the specific frequency of the wave that is entering your eyes. It has to do with the mental construct of red. That is what you experience. It's not accurate, it is practical. It helps you interact with your environment. Now, and there are other types of context, right? If you look at this, it's probably quite ambiguous. Not everyone has a good idea of what this is. And actually, even if you look into the brain and you ask brain measurements, like, what is this? There's really nothing in there. It's mostly noise. If you add a context to these exact same pixels, then all of a sudden, it's quite clearly a car. Now, it's not only that you're now better at guessing that it is a car, just because it's on a road. No, you actually perceive it more as a car. And the brain activity in visual processing regions actually now no longer differs between a completely crisp and clear image of a car and this vague pixelated version of a car. Your brain just sees a car all of a sudden, and before it didn't see anything. So this is not just you guessing, the context is changing the nature, like the very fabric of your conscious perception. And we make a lot of these types of predictions, right? So we know that when things come closer to us, the image on our retina will become larger. We have learned that, right? Because things typically don't grow and shrink unless you're inflating and deflating a balloon. Most things, when you are walking towards me, I don't assume that you're growing while you're doing so, right? That will be very unlikely. So we know that things that come closer actually become larger for our visual system, right? Now, our visual system takes this into account so that we perceive the cars as being more or less the same size. We'll always sort of have a real-world estimate of this car. We account for it just like you account for the cast shadow before. So if you don't have differences in size and you put them back in the scene, what happens is that this distant car looks larger than this nearby car. in your eyes, like the actual image on the retina is the same for this top car and this bottom car, but you are compensating for the fact that one is actually further away and should make a smaller image than the one that is nearby. Your brain does this automatically. You don't have to think about this. I'm going to briefly skip, I think, through this one because it tells more or less the same story. So our brain continuously make predictions and they really change what we perceive. But what if there's nothing to perceive? Well, our brain actually fabricates something that is not there. What if our eyes actually provide no data? So what we did in this experiment is we positioned an object in a room. It's just sort of a very sort of simple 3D environment. And then we rotated the room with the object. And as is the case in normal life, objects rotate congruently with the room they are in, right? Everything rotates at the same way. If I'm walking around something, everything rotates coherently. So what we could do then is that we can make the room rotate, but then hide the object that is in there. Then we do this while participants are in the scanner, and we ask from the brain data, from the fMRI data, whether the fMRI data resembles more a couch that is facing you, as it was beforehand, or a couch that is rotated congruently with the room. And what you see then is that actually the brain is apparently keeping track of the rotation of the couch. The couch is completely hiding behind this occluder, but you rotate the room and your brain is continuously updating this prediction of this object that is not there. True, you're not sort of having a very strong sense, a strong experiential sense of this couch, but your brain is in real time tracking the rotation of this object. Now, you might say this is all nice and fun and games to look at all this brain activity, but I don't experience it. So let's look at something that you can actually experience. Now, if I tell you that your experience, your conscious experience depends on your knowledge, that would mean that if I would be able to change your knowledge in this room, that would also change your conscious experience. So let's try that. Look at this image, and most of you will typically see a brick wall, sometimes with a little bit of lead in it somewhere. You can sort of see the texture, and try to hold on to the image that you're perceiving now. Now I'm going to change your knowledge. Now the knowledge is that there is a cigar here that is pointing out of the wall, right? Oh, my bad. Yeah, crap, okay. Is it still there? Yeah, okay, so there's a cigar pointing out of the wall, and now I think everyone sees the cigar, right? If I were to show you this image 3 months from now, you will immediately see the cigar. And not faintly, it's the most salient thing in this entire image. It's really sticking out of the wall. Now you're looking at the exact same image as a minute before, but your experience has completely changed. Imagine that I would have told you about cigar, but I wouldn't have told your neighbor. Then you would be looking both at the same image, and one be just seeing a blank wall, and the other person clearly seeing a cigar sticking out of it. Now realize that this is what happens on a daily basis because no one is there to show you little outlines of the things that you're missing. Now, by the same token, here you might see a little girl with a bit strange crooked legs. But then if I tell you that she's actually holding a bag of popcorn there, that might change your perception of how you see the girl. Poor girl. And then another image, pay attention. Okay, did you see the little swimmer that was ready to take a dive? Who saw the little swimmer? Quite a few people, okay. So, are you seeing the little swimmer now? Yeah, no, so it's the person on the right that holds her hand like this with an urchin in there. And now, the interesting thing is that once you see it as a hand with an urchin, you're unable to see the little swimmer again, right? Your knowledge has changed and your conscious experience has changed with it. Right, so the visual input never changes, it's just your experience that changes. And these examples may be a little bit contrived, so I cherry-picked some pictures with hidden or ambiguous objects, and then I force you into seeing them, but this happens in the real world as well, right? So this is, for instance, an experiment where people saw a video that ended like this, and then there were a bunch of questions that people had to answer. So one group of people, of participants, got the question, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Another group got the question, how fast were the cars going when they collided? Or when they bumped into each other? When they hit each other? When they contacted each other? And then the speeds that they would report would diminish along with the weaker words. And this is not just them being good participants, because even if they actually place bets, they can actually lose or gain money on their best estimates of the speed, they would still show this effect. So the weaker the word, the slower you think that the car is going. And then they also had this additional question, did you see any broken glass? And then, of course, people were more likely to have seen broken glass when the cars smashed into each other as compared to when they contacted each other, despite having seen the exact same video. And everything that I told you thus far is not specific to visual perception. It's a general principle that applies to all your conscious experiences of the world. And to illustrate this, I'm going to show you, illustrate an audio fragment. And I want to show you that you're able to hear things even if the audio fragment is very crooked. It's very bad quality. Now, what you should hear in this fragment is the word green needle. And please raise your hand if you're able to hear the word green needle in this fragment. Oh, all of you, okay, good. Yeah, so very bad quality, you're able to do this, that's great. Let's try again. So in this fragment, let me know if you're able to hear the word brainstorm. Okay, are you ready? Yeah, you're so quick. So you may have guessed by now, or not, but you heard the same sound clip twice. It's just that whatever you heard was determined by what you were trying to hear, right? That's why explicitly instruct you to do so. So if you don't believe me, you can try to hear them in random order. You can try to hear green needle or brainstorm, or even brain needle or greenstorm. It's up to you. Let's try for a few seconds. Okay, so how unreliable is your conscious experience of the world if you can basically direct it anywhere you want to go, and it also sounds very crisp and clear, right? So the thing is that our brain is trying to find an interpretation of the world that we can work with, and often what we're receiving through our senses is very ambiguous, is very noisy. Consider sort of a restaurant where you're sitting and then you're having a conversation with the person next to you, but then the person across the table is also having a conversation, and there's noises from the table next to that, and somehow you have to filter out the relevant stuff, filter in the irrelevant stuff, and actually the other way around. But it's very difficult to actually make the puzzle pieces fit. So here you really need your predictions to make your experience correct. So let's see how far we can push it. So in this case, I'm going to you're going to hear the chanting of football supporters, and you're going to see the words that you can hear. So just try and hear the words that you're seeing. Now, aside from the fact that I don't know who came up with lactates in pharmacy, the thing is that this is very noisy, right? The sound is very noisy, there are many interpretations, and all your brain needs is a little push in any direction to completely alter your experience. And in this case, the little push can be that they have a British accent. So now let's hear it again and listen to "That is embarrassing," but then with a British accent. Yeah, and then it's quite clear, right? So your brain sometimes only needs a little push, and it completely changes your experience. How much time do I have, Jaap? 10 minutes. Got it. So this does not only apply to what we see or what we hear, but also to what we believe. So there was this experiment where they asked participants to write down the last 2 digits of their phone number, which is of course relatively random, And then these participants had to estimate the height of the Eiffel Tower. And what happened? The people with higher digits also gave higher estimates of the Eiffel Tower. So this prior knowledge is sometimes completely irrelevant, but it still influences your, in this case, your beliefs or your experiences or your guesses. And maybe that's not a big problem, but they did a similar experiment with judges in Israel. And here, judges had to throw a dice, and they would actually give longer sentences, jail sentences, after throwing more dice, or after throwing higher numbers and after throwing lower numbers. And also, just before lunch, when they're still quite hungry, they will give more jail sentences, and after lunch, they will tend to give more community service when they're actually satiated. So, everything we experience is a prediction made by our brain, right? Not only what we see or what we hear, what we believe about the world, also social relations, also our emotions. And Neil Seth, who is a neuroscientist specialized in consciousness research, has this very nice book, which I encourage everyone to read, also explains why your sense of self even is also just an experience like any other that is a product of your knowledge and expectations. Just like what you see, just like your experience of the color red, you also have your experience of who you are as a person, which is also hallucinated by your brain, as he calls it. And people have referred to conscious experience as controlled hallucinations. And people don't like the word hallucination because you think that what I perceive is basically, well, what my eyes register about the world, right? So it's coming from the outside in, and hallucinations are basically things that I just made up, right? That don't have like sort of an actual counterpart in the real outside world. But what I hope to have conveyed until now is that most of your perception is just that. Most of it is just sort of you hallucinating stuff and then adjusting it maybe a little bit on the basis of your sensory input. Now, are we then all continuously tripping? No, most of us luckily are not, because that's the difference between controlled hallucinations and just hallucinations that run wild. With controlled hallucinations, you use your senses to check whether the model, whether your simulation of the world is still correct. 3 times a second, when you make an eye movement, you check whether it's still correct. If it's not, you send back the prediction error. And this is also what goes astray in people that have actual hallucinations, is that either they are not testing their model enough with their senses, or they're not adjusting the model enough. And this is something that those who have done hallucinogenic drugs may have encountered. For instance, if you do magic mushrooms, at first the world is all normal and everyone pretty much agrees on the cupboard being there. And then all of a sudden it's still the cupboard, but it's starting to move a little bit. And then the cupboard is starting to dance. And actually people might differ a little bit on their interpretation of how the cupboard is actually dancing. And at some point it runs completely astray, and there is no basis in reality anymore of your experience. And the point is that all your brains are different, and because your experience is caused by your brain, and because your brain is unique, all of you have different controlled hallucinations. And there's this very famous example of a dress that sort of broke the internet in 2015, and also broke a couple of marriages back then. And we are going to see whether we can replicate it here. Well, not so much the marriages, I hope, but at least sort of the effect. And what happened here is that people completely disagreed on what they would see. Now, I want to know here, who sees the dress as white and gold? Okay. Who sees the dress as black and blue? Oh, there's a nice 50-50 split here. Okay, so now you can fight. No, oh, who sees something else, by the way? Something else? Yeah, okay. No worry, you're not broken. It's okay. Both are fine answers. There actually is a true answer, because the actual dress is black and blue. But that's not the point, of course. What you want to know is what is happening here. And your brain is making a lot of assumptions. So we have seen this before, right? Your brain compensates for the ambient lighting. So there are 2 interpretations here that your brain makes unconsciously. Either the dress is inside, for instance in a shop, where light is predominantly yellow. If you compensate for yellow, what remains is black and blue. Now, if you actually, your brain assumes that the dress is outside, where light is pretty blue, if you compensate for the blue, what remains is mostly yellow or gold, right? And here you can see it happening in front of you. This little droplet of color is moving from the yellow light to the blue light, and just in front of you, it's changing from black and blue to yellow and white, right? You can just see it happening in front of you, right? So no one is really right or wrong here. What's important is all these steps that your brain is making, all these assumptions, right? They're all unconscious. You don't have access to all of these assumptions and processes. The only thing you experience is the end product. It just decided for you, it's white and gold, it's black and blue. Now, I want you to give you a little choice here. You can do two things here. You can take the blue pill and hold on to your belief that the world you experience is sort of actually what is out there, that you have somehow access to this physical reality that is there. Or you take the red pill and accept that the world that you experience is just a mental construct. And it's a fabrication of your brain, and you'll be the only one to ever access your fabrication. It is your mental jail, and no one else will be ever able to access this. Now, here I want to clarify something, because there are streams of philosophy that have made claims about this, and one of this that is important here is idealism. And idealists, which is a stream from the 1800s, or from the 18th century, I should say, but also dates back to Plato, states that reality itself only exists in the brain, that there is no physical world out there. Now, I don't believe that to be the case, no worries. There is even a more extreme form of that, which is solipsism. Solipsism is basically the idea of a person that person has a conscious mind and created the rest. Now, all the solipsists in the world disagree with one another because they all think they are the only conscious entity. Also, they probably don't have conferences, because what's the point of sitting at a conference, speaking to a crowd that you imagined, convincing them that you imagined them? So this is not a very popular theory, but idealism is. And so I would say that full-blown idealism indeed denies the existence of a physical world, and I don't want to go there. So there are physical laws, right? If each of you will try to walk through the door when it's open, you'll be able to get through the door. Each of you who is going to try to walk through the wall is going to fail, right? So there are physical constants. It doesn't matter how you perceive the wall, how much you believe in walls, there are physical limitations. Also, the physical laws govern everything that happens in our brains, right? So they govern how the neurons are firing. They govern sort of the electrical signals that go through our neurons. They govern the growth of neurons and so on, right? So there are physical laws, I'm not going to deny them. However, our experiences cannot be reduced to physical laws. Now, I'm not going to be a dualist. I'm not saying there's something magical out there. The only thing I want to say is that an idea cannot be reduced to just matter or particles or waves. Why? Because for an idea, it doesn't matter if you engrave it in stone, you write it in Chinese in the sand, or you do a choreography expressing the idea. All of those things are made completely of different elements. There's not a single atom overlapping between your choreography and what I engraved in the stone over there, yet the idea would be identical. So ideas are not dependent on the matter that constitutes them. And the same holds for your conscious experience. It is all caused by physical laws, but your experience itself is not a bunch of atoms. It is not a bunch of waves. If you're looking at a car outside, what you're perceiving is not the atoms that constitute the car. What you're perceiving is the concept of a car. Because you could change one by one all the elements of the car, so that in the end, not a single atom of the original car is in the new car, and to you it will still be a car, and it will actually still be the same car. So I don't want to say that there's no physical world. There absolutely is. It governs all of our brain activity. but our conscious experience is basically a hallucination, a simulation that only exists in your world and doesn't have a base in a particular set of atoms. So, how do you see the world through your brains? Well, you have this rich outside world, and somehow your brain navigates all the way to this rich conscious experience that you have, but there's a big bottleneck, which is the poor sensory input. Now, luckily, you can sort of select relevant information, right? Separate the wheat from the chaff. This is what attention is for. So you can select a little bit like which part of the poor information you want to use. But more importantly, what you have is tons of prior knowledge and experience, which you use to generate a simulated world out there. And using Bayesian weighting, you combine it with the new data, the new evidence that you obtained from your senses to adjust your prior knowledge. And this allows for having a very rich experience of the world out there, despite having very poor sensory input and also very relatively low metabolic costs. So, your conscious experience is costly. We've seen that, but it's also all that you have, right? So without it, everything is dark, everything is silent. So it's very important to sort of cherish that, to sort of appreciate that on a daily basis. At the same time, your conscious experience is a tool to interact with the world. It didn't evolve for your pleasure, right? It is used for you to survive. So just like, for instance, in an airplane, what the airplane reports is not the speed of the airplane, it's the speed of the airplane on the ground speed. It's not the actual speed of the airplane, but it's the only useful speed for pilots to have. And by the same token, what you experience is not a veridical representation of what is out there, but is what is useful for you to survive in the world. It's a useful model. Your experience shapes your perception of the world, right? So even if you're looking at the same image, you might experience something vastly different. Why? Because, well, for instance, I know this diagram. For you, it's probably rubbish, but for me, I know this diagram. So the things that are relevant for me personally are highlighted. The things that go together semantically, the things that work together for me are grouped together. The connections that are important for me are enlarged, and the other ones are sort of dismissed. But for you, they're just all a big-ass mess. And in the end, we may look at the same things, but we don't see the same thing. So if you're telling someone, like, well, this is just a cute little puppy, you don't have to be afraid of that dog, just because you perceive it like this, it might be that they perceive it like this. And they will actually perceive the teeth to be longer, and the dog to be larger, and the face to be angrier. If you tell your friend to relax during your skiing holidays, because, well, the slope isn't that steep, they may be experiencing something completely different. And if you ask them, they will actually report that the slope is different. Now, I'm going to skip over this so that we can have a bit of a longer discussion. So, to summarize, your knowledge determines how you perceive the world. And this is a very important realization to empathize with others and their different views on the exact same world. It's also important if you want to communicate your work with others, you have to think about, like, what are the tacit assumptions that I'm making? What is my brain sort of already taking for granted when I'm looking at this, and that they might not take for granted? And it's also important to understand the challenges that others face and that are no longer challenges for you. And I think most importantly, it's important to just appreciate the fact that we actually have this advanced piece of software called consciousness, because it's everything that we have. So, having said that, I want to thank you, and I'm very happy to take some questions or have some discussions.
Thank you for this literally eye-opening lecture. Let's quickly go to the questions because we have 20 minutes left. Yes.
Well, thank you for the amazing lecture. I really had a fun time and obviously excited. I'm really into the topic. And I decided to write my thesis on the topic of sense of self, loss of sense of self, and implication for decision making. And I wasn't aware or swampy that I'm going to get myself into regarding discussion with other people, because what's inherent to your core thesis, the difference between subjective and objective world, it seems that a lot of intelligent, even experts, are not agreeing on that. I came across a lot of physicalists who will dismiss the fact that we can make objective facts about subjective experience. For example, you mentioned hallucination, in which we can make true or false claims about hallucination and nature of it, but they won't be found in the brain. So we can zoom in all we want into neurons, into axons, we won't find a trace of it anywhere. So this is, as you might know, the hard problem of consciousness. So I'm just wondering, what's your stance on it? How scientifically dedicated should we be to solving it in the future? Can it be solved, in your opinion? And how do you approach, and do you have in your experience encounters with people who have completely different view on this topic?
Thanks. So I'm not going to solve the hard problem of consciousness now, unfortunately, or luckily, otherwise none of us will have a job. So yeah, you're right that you can have a perfect understanding of sort of all the neurons, all the synapses, everything, and even then you will have no idea of the conscious experience that that entity has. You can sort of model it in full in the computer, but you won't have that experience unless you are that person. And there's really no way to have an experience unless you are the person who experiences. So if I cannot be you, and I will never have any idea how it is to be you, right? Of course, there's this, you might know, maybe for others don't know, there's this famous philosopher Chalmers who said, like, how is it like to be a bat, right? Imagine, sorry? Nagel, Thomas Nagel, my bad, yeah, my bad. They come to the same conference. Thomas Nagel, what it's like to be a bat. Now imagine, like, all of your experiences are already different, but we all have quite like a similar sort of brain, right? In terms of shape and functioning. But imagine you're a bat and you have echolocation to navigate your the world. Imagine how that would be. You cannot imagine it. That's completely impossible. I think I had another point that I wanted to make. Yeah, so it's impossible. So it's possible to sort of measure objectively what is happening in the brain. The subjective part can never be experienced, but you can still do studies on it, because as data, I can collect what people report to have expected. Right, so I think that is Wundt was one of the first ones to do that. So you can sort of objectively study someone's subjective reports. And sort of in Germany, like 100 years ago or so, they wanted to make this periodic table of not of elements, but then of subjective experiences, and see whether it's possible to have sort of these elementary building blocks of subjective experience. Well, they didn't manage to do so, but there is a way to study subjective experiences objectively, but there's not a way to actually experience them. But then the problem is, why is there an experience at all, right? And at what point does experience suddenly kick in? And I'm not sure we have come a lot closer to that question. It sounds like an unsurmountable gap, but then the same was true for, is there a difference between life and no life? That also seemed to be an unsurmountable gap, and biologists have now found all the little steps in between. So maybe we'll be able to do so, but not me and not now, most probably.
There's another question. Yeah.
Dirk van Beek, thank you for your lecture, very interesting. You started with Plato. What you didn't tell is that one guy stepped out of the cave and he saw a complete different world. And he came back and he said to his fellow buddies who were chained, look what I have seen, it's incredible. And they said, no, you're fooling, that is impossible. Plato had a teacher, that was Socrates, and he had a pupil, that was Aristotle. And both have written a lot about the second part of the human being, the soul. And what we have forgotten is the soul also has a brain. And that brain has a complete different understanding of another world, etc. And what old Greek also knew already with pathos, ethos, and logos. And then the fourth is the part of the soul, so the fourth brain theory, actually. And that comes with a complete different view on the world and how we perceive, etc. This I want to tell you.
Yeah, so there's one thing that sort of popped out there, that is that the soul has a brain. I think I find it hard to...
It's also intuition.
Yeah, So I find it hard to envision if sort of what we often refer to as the soul is that's also a mental construct, but it's something that comes forward from the brain. So it's hard to say that the soul also has a brain. That seems like sort of an endless loop that you will end up in.
That's not only what the old Greek are saying, but also the Native Americans and the Sanskrit Indian people, the Chinese philosophy, etc. So it's not just a specific person or philosophy or whatever, but it's built around.
Yeah.
So that is at least worthwhile to study.
Absolutely, yeah. And often you come into this infinite regression, and that's also the case where consciousness, oftentimes consciousness is seen as sort of this little theater of the mind is one of the metaphors that have been used, because you then see someone in your brain looking at this video screen of your conscious experience out there, but then that person also has a mind. Who is conscious because they're looking at the screen. So what is in their mind? And then they also have a little screen in their head, and then you end up in this infinite regression. And I think that the nice thing about sort of recent theories of consciousness is that they try to explain it as an emerging property where the brain looks at itself, and you don't need to have like a third party looking into the brain. But this is the specific things you're mentioning is something I would need to look into because I'm not familiar enough with that matter.
Thank you for your interesting lecture. I was wondering, so now Neuralink and those kind of brain chips are very interesting to most people. My question is, if you would insert such a brain chip and you would start stimulating your brain with that, would it be like sensory input? So would it be before the filter you're describing and it would just have low bandwidth and it would only give corrections to what your mental image already is? Or would it more resemble, or would it be after the filter? Would it be more like a Rain Man thing that you basically can directly stimulate what your brain perceives with it?
Yeah, I mean, that there are different possibilities there. I think what is important to realize is that we are not aware what the information comes from that we're experiencing, right? We have sort of this brain region, for instance, it's called the fusiform face area, that sort of responds when we're seeing a face. So our experience is we see a face. I don't know, I don't have access to whether the neurons in the fusiform face area are active because my eyes saw a face or because some implant activated those neurons manually. That there, I don't have any access there. So in that regard, it doesn't matter. It depends on where you implant it, where in the root you actually implant it. Now, of course, if you say, now I want to bypass this whole attention thing, I just want to increase memory, then you somehow need more computing power than you have. So then you would also need to add RAM memory and not only sort of throw in information, because then it's otherwise going to come at the cost of other stuff. But I think all connections are possible. I mean, not now technologically, but eventually they're all possible, because a neuron just fires because something behind him told him to fire, and whether it's sensory input or something that you dreamt or thought of, that neuron doesn't know.
Thank you for your lecture. My question was, after your presentation, I'm questioning, does gaslighting really exist? And if so, how can we recognize it? Because if everyone has a different perception on something.
Sorry, does what really exist?
Gaslighting.
Oof. I need to step outside of my comfort area here. Could you give me your definition? Because otherwise I'm going to, yeah. Could you give me your definition of gaslighting?
I think gaslighting is challenging someone's perception on what they like perceive.
Yeah, but there's also a specific tone to it, right? It's not just challenging someone's perception, but maybe you're right that this more general definition. So challenging someone's perception per se, right? If you're not looking into the sort of the social aspects of it, there's nothing wrong with that, but that is not what gaslighting is. But I think challenging someone's perception is fine. Actually, you should challenge also your own perception continuously. The problem is then, when do you do it? Why do you do it? And so on. But then we come into territory that I'm not so familiar with. So I think that's the social aspect, and I don't want to venture into that too much. But please do question your own perception and others' perception, but for like positive reasons.
I saw a hand in the back, so I come running to you.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. It was really, really interesting.
Thanks.
My question would be, is it possible to determine the weighting of how much of the kind of the filtering, or I guess the weighting of the input is innate versus learned? Because I was looking, it was the slide with the cars. There's nothing inherent about the image of a road that tells my brain that the car should be further away. That, to me, feels more like a learned response.
So do you mean innate versus learned, or do you mean in terms of sort of prior knowledge versus evidence gathered from the senses?
I mean, how is it possible to determine how much priority is given to different information based on?
Yeah, I mean, yes, for any specific situation, yes, but not in general, because this is very variable. Now, for instance, the example that I showed you with sort of the football supporters that were chanting something, there, the sensory input, what you received through your senses, was so noisy that it's basically just determined by whatever sort of prior evidence you have, by your knowledge that I provided through the written labels. Right? Sometimes, however, the sensory input is very defined. So when I say the word very defined, you'll have to be very certain of yourself that I'm saying something else to actually hear something else, right? So there the weighting is much more in favor of the sensory input, of the data that you're gathering. So yes, you can measure that on a situation-by-situation basis, and it is incredibly variable because it depends on how certain you are of your prior knowledge for this specific thing, and how convincing, how unambiguous the new evidence is that you gather through your senses.
Hi. Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you. I was wondering, do you know how big the difference of perception is between people? Like, is it only details that differ, or larger perception, or is that just unclear?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's unclear. I mean, we've seen with the dress, right, that people were sort of split in half and completely disagreeing on that. Now, you can wonder how often does something like that take place, because there's not a lot of images that sort of work as well, if you will. So it's a bit unclear how often this takes place. But here we have a relatively, I would say, homogeneous bunch of brains. And still you had very different experiences for this particular example. Now imagine someone who has like a completely different background, a completely different cultural background. Maybe they were born in a country where there's only snow, for instance, and where, right, so then you can already imagine how much bigger these differences are becoming. Imagine you're contrasting it to someone who is very young, a kid who doesn't have that much prior knowledge, right? So the more different the brains, the more different the perception. And to what extent the differences in brains will drive the difference in conscious experience, that relates exactly to this previous question. When the sensory data is very unambiguous, you will have a functionally quite similar response. So you will both experience the word experience as any other time that you heard this word, right? However, it's very well possible, and this is the famous example, is your red, my red. I have no idea whether, if all of you agree that these chairs are red, or maybe they're Bordeaux, I don't care. We all agree on that, right? But even so, it could be that your red is actually my green in terms of experience, or is actually completely different still. And then we come to the first question. We have absolutely no access to that, because I would need to be in your brain. But if I'm in your brain, I cannot relate it to the prior knowledge that I had before when I was in my brain. So in that regard, no idea. But functionally, there will be a lot of overlap, otherwise we could not collaborate, communicate.
No more questions over here. One in the front. I think this will be the last question because it's nearly time.
Merci. Hello. You said not too much about consciousness, but one thing you said, and that is that consciousness is needed to navigate the little spotlight of what you see, or perhaps you can say more generally attention. Yes? And my question is, how consciousness manages what is outside the attention?
Yeah, so I don't think that consciousness is needed per se to navigate, because I can my vacuum cleaner can also navigate quite well through my house without consciousness. But the content of our consciousness is this model of the world that seems to have as a function to help us navigate. So it's a little bit the other way around. And attention is a means to favor certain parts of, to unequally distribute our resources. So, for instance, in the case of vision, it could be that I favor everything that is blue because I'm looking for someone at a festival with a blue shirt on. It could be that I favor everything that's on my left because I want to know what Jaap is going to do after this question. So attention is basically just the unequal distribution of resources. Now, according to most theories of consciousness, there's a big a strong relation between attention and consciousness, which is that for something to become conscious, it requires quite a lot of resources, in the sense that then it would be said in sort of layman's terms that this thing is attended. If you attend something, you devote more resources to it, and that is needed for something to give rise to a conscious experience. There are other theories that make a distinction between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, where access consciousness is, well, I have my experience of the world out here, I am attending something, and that not only do I have an experience of that, but I can also use that information, I can compute with that, I can think and do things with it and report upon it. Whereas the other things, I have an experience, but I cannot report on it. It does fill up my experience, but I have no cognitive capacity because I don't devote sufficient resources there, because I do not attend it. And that is then called phenomenal consciousness. But not all theories make this distinction. For instance, a philosopher like Daniel Dennett would say only what you attend is conscious, and the rest is just sort of is conscious, but it's made up.
Okay, after this question, I'm going to wrap up. So thank you for the lecture. Thank you for being here, for your attention. Next week, Monday, we will have a lecture about democracy. So very important these days. So please join us again next week. Thank you again. One last applause for Jaap.
Thanks.